Hello, I'm Clarence Davis. As we continue our commemorative celebration of the 40th anniversary of Home Rule, we now focus on the movement towards self-determination during the period between 1967 to 1973. Our distinguished panel of scholars, academicians, and historians will address the pivotal series of events that took place in the District of Columbia from 1967 to 1973, prior to the Home Rule Act of 1973. The panelists will discuss the Reorganization Act of 1967, the mayor-commissioner form of government, the elected Board of Education, the Nelson Commission, the establishment of the court system, the 1970 non-voting delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives, culminating with the Home Rule Act of 1973. Joining us to discuss these issues are Dr. Jerome S. Page, former associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of the District of Columbia, Dr. Miles Mark Fisher IV, former president of the University of the District of Columbia, and historian Dr. Bell Julian Clement. Dr. Page, how does the period between 1967 to 1973 compare to the one or more previous periods in the history of the District of Columbia?
Okay, well, when I look back over the history of the governance of the District of Columbia from 1790 up through the formation of the Home Rule government, there were 7 basic periods that existed. There was first a commissioner system, and then there was an elected system with a combination of appointed officials and elected officials. But since the beginning and continuing, there were several key issues that get worked out. One is governance and the relationship between governance and representation. And that's a theme that has continued throughout the history of the District of Columbia, which gets highlighted in the period of 73, around that, up until 67 to 73. The whole question of how should you govern this thing called the District of Columbia, and who should be represented. Another issue that has continued over the period is the question of whose interests should be protected. From the very beginning, there was this struggle between the business class and the local residents and the federal interests. So trying to work out those relationships have continued, and they are getting worked out in this period as well. The question of who gets the right to vote. While the history of the United States talks about democracy, when the District of Columbia was first established, the only people who could vote were white males who owned property. Mm-hmm. So part of the history of the District of Columbia is the expansion of the number of people who could vote and what they could vote for. And this gets carried out again in the period that we're looking at, 67 to 73. So right. A lot of the issues are being recast and reframed and addressed in this period as well.
Right. Dr. Fisher, in conjunction with Dr. Page, during this period between 1967 to 1973, what is the evolution of home rule in the District of Columbia? If you can expand on that as it has been expressed and discussed by Dr. Page.
Yes, as a follow-up to what Dr. Page has indicated, we find about 7 major items that need to be looked at in terms of this period, the movement toward self-determination from 1967 to 73. You have, first of all, the Reorganization Act, which was something very radical and done by President Lyndon Johnson. He took the 3-person commission and transformed it into a 9-person legislative body and an appointed, all of these persons were appointed. And this was the beginning of the expansion of the maximum feasible participation notion, that you're going to get more people involved into what was going on. And this was also consistent with this whole notion of poverty program and lifting the people up. But this also, you had a mayor commission. This is when Mayor Washington was appointed by the president for this position. And also, you will note that on this elected body was the coming first non-voting delegate, Reverend Fauntleroy. And a lot of the people that were in that early mix were the people who continued to be players throughout the ensuing years of the whole notion of home rule.
Dr. Fisher, that's very eloquent how you have amplified that discussion, historical discussion with Dr. Page. And Dr. Clement, what I'd like for you to do is to tell us, share with us about the influence, positive or negative, of the district relationship with the federal government in preparing for home rule, picking up on Dr. Page and Dr. Fisher's comment on this period between 1967 to 1973.
Yes, and of course, Dr. Fisher did just discuss a little bit about some of the important federal programs of that period. And I guess what I would add to the comments that have just been made are two factors. The way I view this period of district history, the district presented both a challenge and an opportunity to the federal government. The challenge went in particular to the presidents. Both President Johnson and President Nixon had an important agenda for the city. In President Johnson's case, one element, as Dr. Fisher just described, was the element of home rule. Yes. This is something that President Johnson considered to be the capstone of his civil rights agenda, getting home rule for the district. And as Dr. Fisher described, when Johnson was unable to do that by statute, he did that by reorganization order in 1967. Yes. Similarly, Nixon was very concerned to use the city as a showcase. He wanted to show that Republican approaches to the city were more effective. And in addition, he had a particular point of interest. He wanted the city to be in good shape to showcase the bicentennial over which he hoped to preside. Urban policy pushed cities in this period, and urban policies, desegregation, highways, public housing, urban renewal, all put stresses on the cities that the district in particular was unable to respond to.
We have to take a short break, but we'll be back in a moment with more of our conversations celebrating the 40th anniversary of Home Rule. Welcome back to our commemoration of the 40th anniversary of Home Rule in the District of Columbia. Dr. Page, during the period between 1967 to 1973, what were the issues being worked out?
Okay, there were a number of issues that are being worked out. The issue of how do you administer this thing called a city? This is a theme that has been running in the history of the District of Columbia. This whole notion that somehow Congress could run a city, whether it's the District of Columbia or any other city, was a major issue. The question of how do you give representation to the local residents? How do you give local residents a say in the national political structure in terms of the Congress and the Senate? The issues of who has a voice in the city. Not only are you beginning to get a push for elections at the local level, but more and more community input into the decisions, expressing the desires and wishes of neighborhoods. And it's also issues related to the question of the fairness and of having a city like the District of Columbia, where people didn't have a right to self-determination in a country which espoused that as a key principle.
Dr. Fisher, what was the significance of the Nelson Commission and the movement towards home rule?
Well, the Nelson Commission was very important in the move toward home rule. Anchor Nelson, the representative from Minnesota, chaired the Nelson Committee. He was also a member of the House District Committee. And one of the things that came out of this was the whole notion of a university for the District of Columbia. And it was Anchor Nelson who was responsible for the Washington Technical Institute and also Federal City College. And both of those schools were put in place as a result of this. In 1968, Cleveland and Denard began to put the Washington Technical School in place, and Carla Randolph began to do Federal City College. And in the first group of students who went to, I think Washington Tech had about 500 and some students who applied to go there. Federal City College had 10,000 applicants, and they selected them 2,000 by draw. They drew for them by lot. So a lot of people thought that Washington Tech would be the predominant kind of interest, but the residents of the District of Columbia picked a Federal City College with 10,000 applicants, and Federal City and Washington Tech had only, say, 500 or 600 applicants for its first class.
Right.
So this is what eventually became a part of the merger which made up UDC.
Sure, absolutely.
Right.
Dr. Clement or Dr. Page, would you like to add to the comments of Dr. Fisher?
Well, the Nelson Commission was, at that time, the most recent reorganization report. If you look at the history of the District of Columbia, every 30, 40 years, or even more frequently, there was some major reorganization report. And one of the reasons that you constantly had these reorganization reports is because, as I mentioned earlier, Congress really couldn't manage the city. So you had to figure out ways to deal with that. So the Nelson Commission report looked at the structure of the government, the structure of the finances, structure of education, made recommendations that ultimately led to the formation of the system of government that we had starting in 1974 with the elections for home rule. So the initial commission report, along with the hearings at the congressional level and at the Senate level, led to the structure which ultimately became the Home Rule Act in 1973, and Home Rule taking effect in 1974.
Right.
And one of the things that Dr. Page alluded to in his last two comments that the Nelson Commission drew together, Dr. Page mentioned this problem of engaging citizens, which the turmoil of the Home Rule period helped to do, and then specifically with the Nelson Commission, the Nelson recommendations, that's the source of our advisory neighborhood commissions, which institutionalized a form of citizen participation in the district.
Absolutely. Dr. Fisher, can you provide us with some comments of the elected Board of Education and the predicate for an elected city council?
Well, the elected Board of Education, I think in 1968, they moved toward an elected Board of Education. And the elected Board of Education, there had been appointed council. That the elected Board of Education was, to me, the dry run to see how well the citizens of the District of Columbia participated in the electoral process. And so they went out with that, and they saw that it could work. And you must note that many of the early council members who were on the council had been previously on the Board of Education. Mayor Barry came from the Board of Education. Linda Kropp, Ms. Kropp came from the Board of Education. Betty Ann Kane came from the Board of Education. Frank Smith came from the Board of Education. So it got people in a position to know how the process worked. It let them dry run and test and see how things could work. And from then on, they moved into an elected city council. And I think that was how I always looked at it. And I might say on a personal note that they had a vacancy on that Board of Education. And they were going to appoint. And I signed up to run. And I went through the process and everything. And then after they got into it, they decided we better have an election. So when they had an election, I dropped out, and Betty Ann Kane, who went on the city council, she ran and she won. And so that's a turn in history that I was participating in the process myself. And that was a great determinant of the direction of which things, and she went on to be on the council and served impressively, you know.
Thank you. We have to take a short break, but we'll be back in a moment with more of our conversation celebrating the 40th anniversary of DC Home Rule. Welcome back to our commemorative celebration of the 40th anniversary of Home Rule in the District of Columbia. Dr. Clement, during the volatile period with the assassination of Dr. King, just a few months after the appointed government under the leadership of Mayor Commissioner Walter Washington, what impact the riot had on the effectiveness of the newly established government in the District of Columbia? And I'd like our panelists to follow up after your response.
Very good. I think three things stand out for me. First, that devastation once again tested district government and showed that under the organization at that time, which, as we've discussed, was prior to the Home Rule Charter, was not capable of responding to that level of urban crisis. Mayor Washington attempted to accelerate a rebuilding effort, but was unable, using that district government to make that happen, and in fact had to go outside of district government, got funding from the Ford Foundation to create the Reconstruction Development Corporation as a nonprofit to begin managing the situation. Second, the devastation called down initial resources from the federal government. And here I'm thinking about President Nixon, who was very concerned that the city would be a showcase for Republican urban policy, was concerned that redevelopment was happening only slowly, and therefore, number one, started off by visiting Shaw, 9th and T Street, a few days after his inauguration and making commitments to the city, and then ultimately providing about $200 million in additional funding to redress the riot corridors. And then the third, and perhaps the most important thing, is that, at least as I read the press of the time, you could imagine that after a conflagration like that, after all that violence, that people would have simmered down, would have withdrawn, would have been afraid, and not want to participate any further. But the opposite, in fact, was what happened. People became citizens of the district, and particularly residents of the affected neighborhoods became more militant in their demands, and that was something that the city government then had to respond to.
Dr. Fisher.
Yes, I would say that it was a significant period in time. Congressman Fauntleroy had been one of the leaders in the whole Shaw area. And out of all of this, his base was used to put him into Congress. And so that was a feature that came out of what was going on after the riots. But there was a group that came together called Voice, and that is the voice of informed community expression. And that group put together all of the leaders after the riot, and that was a group that began to push the different moves in legislation for the effectuating of the Home Rule piece as it was. And eventually I was one of the last presidents of that group before it went out of business. And that's a group that played a very important role. Everybody who was anybody was on that group. And they were the catalyst for impacting the government and making things happen. And so I think that that all, in addition to what happened at King's death, this was a piece that added to the future development of the Home Rule piece in the District of Columbia.
Dr. Page.
I think the events surrounding or following the assassination of King accelerated the need for Home Rule. in the District of Columbia. There were a lot of issues that needed to be addressed in the city, transportation, housing, the effects of urban development, and the expression of outrage as a result of the assassination of King just highlighted the fact that we needed a new form of government in order to manage the city. And I would put it in context, too, that by 1968, across the country, many of the cities were seen to be unmanageable, starting with Watts in '64. So that there was something amiss as a result of the effects of the Great Migration and the concentration of African Americans in cities without ample political power and without ample economic power that led to this explosion. And so you had these tensions that needed to be addressed, and part of that resulted in for the District of Columbia, led to the home rule government.
Okay, Dr. Page, if I can ask you to respond to the next question, and all of the panelists give me some short, concise. As we look at this 40 years of celebration, what are the roadblocks ahead for home rule?
I think the major roadblock now is making sure we have an engaged citizenry.
Dr. Fisher.
Well, I think the future is determined by where the economy is going and who are the people that are being elected to Congress. I think that's going to have a great role in determining where we're going to go, the kinds of people, because we have to have a bipartisan approach. Everybody has to work together to get things done. And I think that this is going to determine where the future of this goes. And bringing back the spirit that existed back in the 60s and the 70s, when people were concerned about doing away with poverty, helping the underclass, the unemployed, and all of that. We got to go back to the basic issues, and these issues will determine where we're going to go with this.
Dr. Clement.
Frederick Douglass said, "The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." So I'd go with Dr. Page, and I think Dr. Fisher said it as well. When the district citizens demand representation and home rule, we'll have it.
That concludes our panel discussion. Thank you to our panelists. I'm Clarence Davis. Thanks for watching.